The grand auditorium of the U.S. Naval Operations Command was packed to capacity. Rows of white uniforms, brass buttons gleaming under the dome lights, sat in strict formation. Photographers hovered discreetly in corners, their lenses aimed toward the elevated stage. The air was thick with pride and pageantry. An atmosphere of victory and valor floated through the room like incense in a sacred hall. Thought at the front row sat Admiral Marcus Lee, a stern figure whose reputation stretched across oceans. His chest bore an intimidating lineup of ribbons and medals each, earned through blood, precision, and command. He wasn't easily impressed. Over decades of service, he had seen heroes rise and fall, stories bloom and fade, but today his eyes were fixed on one name listed on the program, one he'd heard spoken in hushed tones throughout the Navy corridors. Lieutenant Eva Callahan. She wasn't what he expected. When her name was called, there was no roar of excitement, just a reverent hush. Every head turned. Eva stood from her seat in the third row, straight-backed and composed. Her face held no visible emotion, and her movements were precise, efficient. She didn't scan the crowd or bask in the moment. Instead, she marched forward like it was another day on base, another standard protocol. The announcer's voice echoed across the auditorium, recounting fragments of a classified mission. Lieutenant Callahan is awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during an operation in the South Pacific. He read from a prepared citation, one carefully sanitized for public ears. Words like bravery, initiative, and combat excellence floated out, but they felt too small for the weight Eva seemed to carry in her silence. The details of her mission remained classified, even 2 years after it had occurred. Rumors circulated among enlisted men, whispers of a brutal ambush, of teammates dragged from the jaws of death, of a lone woman who refused to be medevaced despite her own critical injuries. Most thought the stories were exaggerated. Some believed she'd been protected by top brass. But no one doubted something unforgettable had happened. Admiral Lee watched her climb the steps with mechanical grace. Her posture was perfect. Too perfect. Not the prideful kind seen in soldiers eager for recognition, but the kind honed from years of burying pain. She saluted with precision, eyes level, jaw clenched. He stood from his seat and approached her on stage. For a moment their eyes met hers, steely but sunken, his sharp and inquisitive. He shook her hand firmly and placed the medal against her uniform. The audience applauded, rising to their feet in waves. Cameras flashed, but Eva barely blinked. No tears, no smile, just a nod of acknowledgement. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," Lee said quietly. "Thank you, sir," she replied, voice low. He wanted to ask more, wanted to pull her aside and say what really happened out there. Why are you still carrying this weight like armor? But this wasn't the place. The ceremony rolled on. Other names were called and Eva returned to her seat as though nothing had occurred, but the Admiral's curiosity didn't fade. As the ceremony wrapped up, the crowd began to loosen. Officers mingled. Reporters prepared their articles. Families embraced their decorated sons and daughters. Yet Eva remained distant, exchanging a few polite words, always standing alone, as if some part of her still resided back in that jungle. Admiral Lee waited and made his way toward her. "Lieutenant Callahan," he said. She turned, saluting. Him again. He returned the gesture. "Walk with me." She hesitated just for a second, but then followed him out of the hall and down a quiet corridor lined with portraits of fallen heroes. "You refused this medal once." Lee said, his voice even. "I did, sir," she replied. "Why accept it now?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes trailed over the framed photograph. So many young faces frozen in time. "I thought no one cared enough to ask why," she finally said. Lee stopped walking. Her tone was strange, not rebellious, not bitter, just ... exhausted. Someone who had carried something too long and had almost forgotten what it felt like to lay it down. "I read your file," he said, "but I know how files can lie." Ava's jaw tightened. "They don't lie, sir. They just leave things out." He watched her closely now, trying to read what the citations and reports had failed to capture. "I authorized that mission," he said. "I remember the details. Covert insertion, classified coordinates, intelligence indicated light resistance. You were leading a small recon squad." "You remember wrong," she said, voice soft but unwavering. Lee's brows furrowed. "How?" So she turned to face him fully, something raw flickering in her gaze. "We were sent into a trap, Admiral. We weren't supposed to come back." He was stunned by the conviction in her tone. "You think the mission was compromised?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of voices from the auditorium. Then she said something that caught him off guard. "If you really want to know why I didn't want the medal, you need to see what it actually cost." Lee's expression shifted. "What do you mean?" Eva stepped closer, eyes locked on his. "Not just in body, sir. In bone. In blood." And before he could respond, she looked over her shoulder, nodded toward a nearby security door, and said, "Come with me. I'll show you." The helicopter blades thundered overhead as the small team of Navy operatives dropped into dense jungle under the cover of night. Lieutenant Eva Callahan had gone over the mission briefing a dozen times. Their target was clear. Extract Dr. Tomas Vera, an American scientist kidnapped by insurgents near the Solomon Islands. It was supposed to be a low-profile in and out. No firefight, no resistance, a quiet ghost mission. But from the first step on the ground, something felt wrong. The humidity was choking, the air unusually silent, too still for an area supposedly crawling with guerrilla movement. Ava's boots sunk into wet soil as she led her 5-person team deeper into the trees. Radio signals were clean, no chatter. The GPS beacon attached to the scientist's collar was moving almost as if it was being carried. "Team Bravo, this is Callahan. Proceed with caution. This might not be what it looks like," she warned through her headset. They didn't get far. Dot. Suddenly, the forest exploded with light and sound. A rain of bullets screamed from the tree. Mines erupted beneath the soil. The jungle moments before so still was alive with death. "Ambush, take cover," Eva shouted, diving behind a fallen tree as her communications officer went down with a shot to the neck. Screams echoed around her. Chaos swallowed everything. Eva scrambled toward the nearest injured man. Petty Officer Ruiz. Blood poured from Oiz. Blood poured from her. A gash on his thigh. She dragged him behind a rock just as another blast ripped through the air, slamming her body into the ground. Something sharp tore into her side, white-hot pain slicing through her ribs like a blade. She gasped but stayed conscious. She reached for Ruiz again, lifted him despite the searing agony, and moved. That was the beginning of a 3-mile journey that no one was supposed to survive. She didn't remember most of the trek, only flashes, pulling one teammate, then the next, her own blood soaking through her uniform, breathing so shallow she thought she might suffocate. At one point, she had to bite her own sleeve to keep from screaming and giving away their location. By dawn, she'd somehow dragged 3 men, one unconscious, one sobbing, one barely breathing, to the edge of the extraction point. Her arms were shaking. She dropped to one knee. Vision blurred. A Navy SEAL medic approached. "Jesus Christ, what happened?" Ava's voice was almost gone. "They're alive. Take them." She blacked out. When she woke up in the hospital in Guam, her chest felt like it was wrapped in fire. Tubes in her nose, 4 in her arm. A nurse stood at her side. "You're lucky to be alive," the nurse said gently. "You had internal bleeding and broken ribs. 2 fragments of shrapnel are still embedded. The doctor said removing them would be risky, too close to your lungs." Eva tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She lifted her hand slightly and gestured for a pen. On the hospital form beside her, she scribbled, "How many made it?" The nurse smiled, eyes soft. 3, thanks to you. The Navy wanted a statement. The press wanted interviews. Command wanted to parade her as the face of valor, but Eva refused them all. Her commanding officer visited once. He gave her a medal recommendation form and said, "Just saw, you've earned it." She looked him dead in the eyes. "Who gave the mission order?" He hesitated. Why does it matter? It was a setup. He didn't respond. Eva tore up the form. When she returned to base 2 months later, her body was functional, but her spirit was fractured. She moved like a ghost. She did her duties, trained recruits, and kept quiet. The Navy promoted her to lieutenant, but she refused ceremonial honors. The medal was mailed to her. She mailed it back. For a year, she spoke to almost no one outside her unit. Some of the men she saved came to thank her. One even cried. She hugged them, smiled, and returned to silence. She had grown used to the sound of pain when it was hidden behind respect. Her body healed, but the 2 metal fragments inside her never moved. They were reminders, literal pieces of that night forever stuck beneath her skin. Sometimes at night she would press her fingers gently against her ribs, feeling the small, rigid lumps, not because they hurt, but because she needed to remember. It was real. One rainy afternoon, a young cadet asked her during a training exercise, "Ma'am, is it true what they say about the jungle mission?" Eva looked at her. The girl couldn't have been older than 21, wide-eyed, hopeful, just like she had once been. "What do they say?" Eva asked softly. "That you carried 3 grown men for miles, that you didn't even cry." Eva chuckled for the first time in months. "I cried," she said, "just not where anyone could see it." Now, standing outside the awards ceremony hall with Admiral Lee, Eva felt the memories rushing back. "You aren't supposed to come back," he had said. She stared at him. "That's right, but I did." Then she walked toward the door at the end of the hall and opened it. "If you really want to know the truth, Admiral ... come see what's still inside me." He followed, confused, but silent as the door shut behind them. The small briefing room was empty. White walls, a table, and 2 chairs. No surveillance, no interruptions. Admiral Marcus Lee entered cautiously, the door closing behind him with a soft metallic click. Lieutenant Eva Callahan stood at the far and back turned, hands resting on the edge of the table. "I haven't been in this room since my debrief," she said quietly, eyes scanning the sterile walls. "Funny how places hold echoes." The Admiral remained silent. He wasn't sure what he was about to witness, but something told him it would change the way he viewed command forever. Eva turned around slowly and unbuttoned. Her dress blues with quiet defiance. Her undershirt clung tightly to her skin. The measured calm. She raised it just high enough to reveal the scarred landscape across her right side. Lee took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. The scars were not clean or symmetrical. They were brutal, twisting lines of torn flesh and discoloration that told the story of torn muscle, fractured bone, and battlefield medicine done in the dirt. Just beneath her ribcage, 2 hard lumps pressed against her skin, fragments of metal still embedded after 2 years. Eva dropped the shirt back down and buttoned her uniform in silence. The Admiral sat down slowly. His hands trembled slightly. "Why didn't they take them out?" he finally asked, voice almost a whisper. "They're too close to the lung. Removing them risks puncturing it. I chose to leave them in." He stared at her. "You live with that every day?" She nodded. "They ache during storms, sometimes during PT. Most of the time I forget they're there until I see people clapping and giving me medals." Lee leaned back. The medals, the ceremony, the file, all of it felt hollow now. "I've seen combat injuries," he said slowly. "But that's different." "It's not just the scars," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "It's what came after." Eva looked him in the eye for the first time since they entered the room. "After the extraction, I woke up in Guam. No command debrief. No questions. Just a nurse, a promotion, and orders to rest." "You weren't interviewed?" Lee asked, eyebrows rising. "Only once by a captain I'd never met. He asked 3 questions, then me, and left. A week later, I was being recommended for a Navy Cross." Lee clenched his jaw. "That's not protocol." "No, sir. It's damage control." Her words hit like a slap. The Admiral leaned forward, tension growing in his spine. You saying this was buried? Eva nodded, because someone messed up badly, and they didn't want the story to get out. There was a long pause. Lee thought back to the orders, the satellite imagery, the mission green-lighted from his office. At the time, everything seemed routine, quiet extraction. Low risk, no red flags. How did you know it was a setup? He asked. I didn't at first, she said, but then I noticed the way the enemy moved, the way they boxed us in. They knew exactly where we'd land and when. Lee processed her words slowly. Did you report your suspicions? Eva smiled bitterly. Who was I going to tell? The man who signed the orders? That one cut deep. I took the blame, she continued. Not officially, but in spirit. My silence let the Navy spin it into a story of courage under fire. They needed a hero. I gave them one. And the men you saved, he asked? They don't know the full truth. Only that I pulled them out. That's enough for them. It has to be. Lee leaned forward, voice low. Why tell me now? Because I saw your eyes during that ceremony. Eva replied. You looked at me like you wanted to know the real story, not the file. And because I'm tired, Admiral. Tired of pretending these scars mean glory when they're really just survival. She paused, letting the silence sit. I don't want medals for surviving something I was never meant to. I want accountability. Admiral Lee stood up and walked to the window. The city skyline stretched across the horizon. Below, civilians went about their day, blissfully unaware of what happened in jungles half a world away. I've spent my career thinking I knew what sacrifice looked like, he said, but I've never had to live with pieces of war inside my body. I gave orders. I trusted the system. He turned back to her. You think there's still a leak in the command chain? I think there was, Eva said. Whether they're still active, I don't know. But someone sent us into that jungle knowing we wouldn't come out. Lee nodded slowly. I can open an internal review quietly. No promises on what I'll find, but I'll try. Pavey stood. That's all I ask. As she turned to leave, he stopped her. One more question. She looked back. Why keep serving after all this? She gave him a small, tired smile. Because the uniform didn't fail me. People did, and I'm not going to let them be the only ones wearing it. With that, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, shoulders straight, chin high. The Admiral remained inside, eyes locked on the empty chair she'd left behind. In that silence, he realized something profound. Some heroes don't need medals. They just need to be heard. The next morning, Admiral Marcus Lee sat alone in his office. The file on Lieutenant Eva Callahan open in front of him. Dozens of pages, commendations, mission summaries, promotion records lay neatly stacked, but none of them captured the woman he'd met yesterday. She had turned the Navy's most prestigious ceremony into something deeply uncomfortable. Not through protest or defiance, but through honesty. Through scars that told the truth. Words couldn't. Lee stared out the window. The city moved like clockwork outside. Ships docked at the harbor. A carrier preparing to deploy, but he couldn't shake the look in Ava's eyes. It haunted him. He picked up the phone and made a call to Naval Intelligence. I want a complete reevaluation of Operation HighTorch. Pull internal communications from all levels prior to deployment, classified and unclassified. I'll sign the override myself. The voice on the other end paused. Sir, that operation was closed 2 years ago, and the directive I don't care about directives. We opened the damn case. He slammed the phone down. Minutes later, his aide entered. Sir, Lieutenant Kalen is in the building. She came unannounced. Should I send her in? Eva stepped in without hesitation, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. She saluted, and the Admiral returned it. She looked better, rested than yesterday, but her presence still carried a weight like she never fully left the battlefield. I figured you might have questions, she said. He gestured to the chair across from him. I do. She sat, hands folded neatly in her lap. You said someone compromised your mission, he began. That it was deliberate. Eva nodded. Yes, sir. Have you told anyone else? No. If I had, I wouldn't be here in uniform. The brows lifted slightly. You think it would have gone that far? Eva looked him straight in the eye. If someone was willing to sacrifice 6 American lives for unknown reasons, what do you think they would do to the one person who survived? To talk about it. The Admiral didn't respond immediately. He knew she was right. The world outside the service saw war, his strategy and bravery. But inside among the ranks there were shadows, operations that were sanctioned under questionable ethics, covered up for political safety, or buried to protect careers. It was rare, but it happened, and when it did, soldiers like Eva were the ones left holding the burden. You believe there was a leak. Do you know who? He asked. Eva shook her head. Not exactly, but I have theories. Someone embedded high enough to redirect satellite data and override on ground delay protocols. Lee pulled a folder from his drawer and slid it toward her. I reopened the mission record this morning, he said. Within the original briefings, there's a time-stop anomaly. An intercepted distress signal from the area came in 40 minutes before your team deployed. Eva blinked. 40 minutes before? Yes, but the file was backdated. I never saw it. Someone buried it, changed the time logs, and greenlit the mission, despite knowing you'd be walking into an ambush. She leaned back in the chair, jaw tight, and they almost got away with it. Lee looked down at the folder again. There's more. He said your mission wasn't just an extraction. That scientist, Dr. Thomas Vera, he was already dead when your team hit the ground. Eva stared at him, eyes narrowing. That wasn't in the briefing. Exactly, the Admiral said, because it was never supposed to be a rescue. It was a test run for a new satellite-guided drone targeting system. Your team was the control variable, and someone decided to run the test. Live. The words hit Eva like a punch to the chest. They used us. Yes, he said quietly. Silence filled the room like fog. They sacrificed my team for a weapons test. Lee nodded grimly and covered it up by painting you as a hero. They knew you'd survive or hoped you wouldn't. Either way, they'd gain narrative control. Eva stood, pacing now, her hands balled into fists. I should have spoken up. I should have pushed harder. You did what you could to protect your team. You stayed silent to shield them from being dragged through hearings to protect the Navy's image. That's not weakness. That's leadership, he said firmly. Eva stopped pacing and turned to him. So what now? I'm escalating it to the Inspector General. Lee said it won't be public. Not yet, but someone will answer for this. She sat down again, calmer now, but the fire still in her eyes. And what about the truth? She asked. Will it ever come out? Lee gave her a long look. Truth is like pressure. You can keep it contained for a while, but eventually it bursts through. Eva gave a small nod. Then I'll wait. He glanced toward her ribs. How is the pain? She smirked slightly. Always there, but today, it hurts less. Lee offered her something unexpected. A smile. There's one last thing, he said, reaching into his drawer. He pulled out a metal box, one that looked different than the standard issue. Eva frowned. What's this? He opened it. Inside was a silver emblem, simple, sharp and new. The Integrity Star, he said, drafted this morning. Only one in existence. It's not for battlefield courage. It's for those who choose the harder truth over the easier lie. He stood and pinned it to her chest. No cameras, no ceremony, just respect. And in that quiet moment, the Admiral finally saw her not as a myth, not as a headline, but as the soldier who came back when she wasn't supposed to, and still found the courage to tell the truth. The hallway outside Admiral Lee's office was quiet, but Eva could hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She had always believed that the body remembered pain even after the mind tried to forget. Today proved it. The Integrity Star weighed lightly on her chest, but it carried something heavier: acknowledgement. not just for what she did, but for what she survived. For once, she hadn't been reduced to a commendation or a decorated statistic. The Admiral had seen her. Still, the past didn't ease just because someone finally listened. As she walked toward the base infirmary for a scheduled scan, she passed a group of junior officers whispering behind their coffee mugs. "That's her," one murmured. The jungle op girl Eva didn't react. She'd grown used to being a ghost in uniform, too real for rumor, too legendary for comfort. Her scars, invisible beneath her jacket, still defined her story in ways words couldn't. But something had shifted. Later that afternoon, Admiral Lee called a private gathering, 5 officers in a classified conference room deep within the Naval Command building. Among them were representatives from Naval Intelligence, the JA Corps, and the Office of the Inspector General. Eva sat at the end of the long table, calm but alert. The Admiral stood at the head. "Everyone in this room has clearance and a vested interest in truth," he began. "What we discuss today does not leave these walls until it's time." He turned to Eva. "Lieutenant, proceed." She stood, then unbuttoned her jacket. Without hesitation, she lifted her undershirt to reveal the scars once more. Dot. No one in the room spoke. One officer's eyes widened. Another winced. A third simply looked away. "These are shrapnel wounds," she said. "Sustained during Operation HighTorch. 2 of the fragments are still in my body. The rest were removed. I received no warning before deployment. No backup, no preemptive strike." She lowered her shirt and buttoned up slowly. "I was told the mission was an extraction, but we now know it was a cover, a live weapons test with my team as bait." The JAG officer, Commander Darnell, shifted uncomfortably. "We've reviewed the preliminary findings. A time-stunk tampering was confirmed. There's evidence a data feed was rerouted through a private contractor connected to a defense tech firm, Orion Systems." Eva nodded. "That's the name I saw in the satellite logs. Orion was subcontracted to test a new thermal guidance drone protocol. But the drones never arrived," another officer interjected. "They were never supposed to," Admiral Lee replied. "The point wasn't a successful rescue. The point was observing our team's movements in real time against guerrilla ambush tactics to see if a predictive algorithm could recreate their path. The revelation hit the room like a detonation, so they sent real soldiers into enemy territory just to collect movement data." Darnell asked, stun double quotes. "Yes," Eva answered. "And when we were attacked, they let it play out." The Inspector General's representative, a thin woman named Coburn, leaned forward. "This is enough to open a criminal investigation. Potential charges could include unauthorized operations, falsification of records, and negligent homicide." Admiral Lee folded his arms. "We're not bearing this." "No, sir," Holborn agreed. "But we'll need a statement from Lieutenant Callahan, an official one." Ava took a breath. For years, she'd imagined this moment when she would finally speak the truth out loud without fear of reprisal. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhale. "I'll give you my statement," she said. Everyone nodded. A sense of seriousness settled over the room as they stood to leave. One of the officers, Commander Rizzo, approached her quietly. "I served in Holland," he said. "Lost good men to a bad call. But I never had the guts to say what you just did." Eva met his eyes. "You still can," he gave a faint smile. "Maybe now." Outside, the sky had darkened. Clouds rolled over the capital, casting long shadows across the base. Eva walked alone toward the barracks, the air thick with oncoming rain. Halfway there, she felt a twinge in her side. The shrapnel, dormant for days, reminded her it was still there. She stopped, placed her hand lightly over her ribs. It hurt, but less. That night, she stood in front of her mirror, her shirt off, the room lit only by the dim bedside lamp. She studied the marks on her skin. The scars were still jagged, still raw in places, but they were no longer symbols of silence. They were evidence, and now they were speaking. The early morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of the Naval Review Board's secure conference chamber. Admiral Marcus Lee sat at the head of the table once again, flanked this time by higher-ranking officers, legal advisors, and civilian defense liaison. Something had shifted since Avisa's private reveal. The mood now wasn't just professional, it was combative. Out across from him sat Vice Admiral Penrose, who had overseen procurement contracts for the South Pacific region during Operation HighTorch. I don't see the purpose of revisiting a closed file from 2 years ago, Penrose said flatly. The purpose, Lee answered calmly, is accountability. Eva Callahan entered just as he finished speaking, dressed in her formal blues, her ribbon bar perfectly aligned, her chin held high. She was no longer just the survivor. She was the whistleblower. Penrose narrowed his eyes. Lieutenant Callahan, I've reviewed your field file. What you endured is unfortunate, but wartime missions carry risk. Eva stood in front of the room. With respect, sir, it wasn't war. It was betrayal. The words cut through the air. The mission I led into the jungle wasn't compromised by accident, she continued. The coordinates we received were accurate to the last decimal, but not for a rescue. They placed us directly into enemy hands. The enemy knew we were coming because someone told them. Murmurs circled the room. Some officers leaned forward, others sat still, their silence louder than words. And how can you be so certain? Penrose asked. Eva reached into her file and handed out 3 printed documents. Decrypted satellite path records, timestamp logs from Orion systems, and a classified memo she wasn't supposed to have. This, she said, is a transmission between Orion systems and a Navy data relay contractor. It contains a field ID that matches our team's mission code. It was sent 11 hours before deployment, long before any of us hit the ground. Penrose examined it. You are not cleared to access these files. I know, she said. But I had to show you the truth. Penrose's tone hardened. That's a violation of security protocol. Admiral Lee jumped in. You're focusing on clearance, Admiral, when you should be focused on content. This confirms our worst fear that the mission was manipulated from inside. Eva nodded. And that's not all. She placed a photo on the table. It was blurry, taken by a drone long before the mission launched, but recognizable. A group of insurgents unloading crates from a small boat marked with Orion Security subcontractor logo. The enemy received our tech, Eva said. Directly or indirectly, Orion Systems trafficked sensitive material into a hostile zone, and then they used our team to test their experimental targeting model. Someone swore under their breath. Another officer stood and left the room clearly. Admiral Lee closed his folder. The Navy won't be used as a testing ground for private industry profit, not on my watch. This isn't just sabotage, it's treason. Vice Admiral Penrose adjusted his collar. These are accusations, not verdicts. Then let's find out, Lee said. I've already initiated a joint investigation with the Department of Defense and Naval Criminal Investigative Services. A formal inquiry will begin tomorrow. You will be called to testify. Penrose stiffened. You're overstepping your command. Eva leaned forward. No, sir. We're finally doing what command is supposed to do. Protect its people. The room fell into uneasy silence. The tide had turned. That evening, Eva sat alone on a park bench across from the water. The Pitauak shimmered beneath the fading gold of twilight. The air was cooler now, crisp, clean. It was the first breath she'd taken in a long time that didn't feel like it. Dot. She heard a voice behind her. You should have been a lawyer. Admiral Lee approached and sat beside her, a coffee in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. Eva chuckled. I've had a lot of practice arguing with walls. He handed her the envelope. She opened it carefully and found the letter inside. Official. Navy letterhead, her name at the top in one word in bold. Cleared. I filed an early immunity motion on your behalf, he said. For accessing the files, you won't face charges. She blinked, stunned. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You protected this uniform more fiercely than most people who wear it their whole lives. She stared at the river. I thought if I told the truth, they'd silence me. They tried, he said, but you made sure your scar spoke louder than their secrets. He stood to leave, but paused. You're not done yet, he said. Eva looked at him, meaning, after all this, people are going to look at you differently. Some will hate you, some will admire you, but most will follow your lead. You've got more to teach than combat tactics. She didn't respond right away. Finally, she asked, what if I'm not ready? You are, Lee said. Because you didn't survive to be silent, you survived to lead. He walked away, leaving Eva holding the letter and something heavier. Purpose. Weeks passed, and the storm Eva had set in motion was no longer behind closed doors. The investigation made headlines across defense channels. Orion Systems' boardroom trembled under pressure, and 2 senior Navy officers were placed on administrative leave. The scandal had a name now, Project Cold Trail. Eva had become an unlikely symbol not just of survival, but of reckoning. One morning as she arrived at the naval base, she noticed a small group of cadets standing outside the officers' mess. They straightened up when they saw her. One, barely 20, offered a crisp salute. Ma'am, just wanted to say thank you for not letting them bury it. Eva nodded, her throat catching. She was getting used to being thanked for surviving what she'd never volunteered to endure. Inside, the Admiral's assistant handed her a sealed folder. Admiral Lee said, "You're cleared to review this personally." She opened it and found something unexpected. A redeployment request for her. It wasn't combat. It wasn't punitive. It was advisory, attached to a classified reform task force meant to audit all missions related to advanced defense contractors. She would act as the field voice among the policymakers, and she would have rank influence. Eva sat down slowly. She wasn't being sidelined, she was being elevated. But was she ready to carry this fight into the system itself? Later that afternoon, Eva walked into Admiral Lee's office. He stood at the window reading a memo. Without turning, he spoke. "Knew you'd come. You want me to help fix it?" she asked. He turned. "No, I want you to help rebuild it." Eva glanced at the folder again. "That system almost killed me. That's why it needs someone who survived it." She hesitated. "What if they don't listen?" "They will," he said. "Because if they don't, you'll make sure they do." That night, Eva visited an old friend, Sergeant Malik Bennett. He was the only other survivor from her team during Operation High. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. He met her outside a small veteran center. His limp was worse now and the burned scars on his hand hadn't faded, but his eyes still held fire. "I saw the hearings," he said. "You were a force." Eva smiled softly. "I wish we'd all made it back." Malik nodded. "I do too. But you made it mean something. That's more than I could have hoped." She handed him a copy of her statement. "It's all here. Every lie, every thread." He took it gently. "You still carry the guilt every day?" She admitted. He leaned back, looking at the stars. "Then carry it like armor. You're the reason they'll think twice next time." They sat together in silence for a while, not the painful kind, but the kind where no words were needed. The next week, Eva boarded a plane bound for DC destination, Pentagon. She was met by Defense Secretary Langston, who had personally requested her presence at the strategy panel. Unlike most officials, Langston was direct. "We've created an entire combat doctrine around tech partnerships. That's not the issue," he said. "The issue is letting those partnerships override human judgment. We need fail-safes, and we need warfighters like you shaping them." Eva didn't respond immediately. Langston continued. "They'll tell you policy isn't personal, but you and I both know it always is." Eva looked him straight in the eye. "Then let's make it personal for the right reasons." The first meeting was tense. Generals, engineers, contractors, lobbyists, the people who made decisions from screens and spreadsheets, were now sitting across from the woman whose scars testified to their failures. One executive cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Callahan, with all due respect, war is unpredictable." Collateral risk is part of the calculus. AA stared and flinch. You call it calculus. I call it 37 minutes on the jungle floor, watching my teammates die because a drone feed wasn't optimized yet. The room fell silent. Dot. She pushed forward. You want better algorithms? Fine, but stop treating soldiers like variables. Someone whispered. She's not wrong. The shift was beginning. Dot. In the evenings, Eva would return to her hotel room exhausted, but unwavering. Her ribs still ached, especially in the cold. She'd trace the lines of her scars while reviewing new proposals, this time not as the subject of another failed mission, but as the force reshaping future ones. She still woke sometimes from old dreams. Gunfire, smoke, Malik shouting her name, but now when she woke she reached for her tablet, not her pistol. This fight wasn't over, but it was hers now, and she was finally winning. 6 months later, the Pentagon's newly established Joint Ethics and Field Innovation Council released its first operational policy reforms. Embedded within them was the Callahan Clause, a mandatory field agent review process that gave experienced service members the power to halt or amend contractor missions if risk exceeded live combat thresholds. Dele's name was on every memo. Dot. The reforms were sweeping. Private defense firms now had to submit real-time operational transparency logs, and whistleblower protections for field officers were expanded. But the real shift came in culture. Soldiers now had a voice inside the rooms that once made decisions. Without them, Eva, once just a lieutenant with a haunted past, was now a military advisor, one of the youngest ever to serve in that role. She still wore the uniform, not for rank, for principle. One evening after a long debriefing with NATO allies, Eva stood alone in a Pentagon hallway staring at a digital display of fallen heroes. Her fingers hovered over her old teen's photo. She whispered each of their names. Walker, Diaz, Franks, Kim, Ree. They were more than data points, more than operational losses. They were the reason she never gave up. Hey, came a voice behind her. Dot. It was Admiral Lee. He had aged in those 6 months, lines deeper, hair grayer, but his presence remained immovable. I heard the NATO brief went well, he said. Not even nodded. They listened. That's all you ever wanted. She smiled. No, I wanted them to understand. He stepped beside her and looked at the wall of names. You gave them something they couldn't deny, a truth no one could explain. Away. Eva looked down. I thought I'd feel lighter after all this. You won, he reminded her. She turned to him. Winning doesn't bring them back. No, he said, but it keeps others from joining them too soon. Months later, Eva was invited to speak at the U.S. Naval Academy. The auditorium was packed. Rows of cadetses in crisp uniforms waited, whispering to each other as she stepped up to the podium. She didn't open with a prepared speech. Instead, she looked at them and said, You'll hear about glory. You'll hear about sacrifice, but what they won't always tell you is how to survive what you lose and how to speak when you're told to stay silent. The crowd quieted. Dot. She slowly raised her left hand and placed it over the scar on her side. This, she said, was meant to be forgotten, but it became the loudest part of my story. Her voice didn't shake. It rang with truth. I stand here not because I was the strongest, but because I couldn't walk away knowing I had a voice others didn't. You won't always be believed, but speak anyway. The ones who matter will hear you. Silence, then thunderous applause. That night, dozens of young cadets came up to her, asking how to lead, how to fight injustice, how to endure when alone. Eva didn't offer perfect answers. She offered honesty. Dot. And sometimes that was enough. Dot. In the months that followed, her scar became a symbol not of pain but of power. She was featured in military publications, defense panels, even civilian conferences on ethics in AI warfare, not for fame, for impact. Dot. She still visited the Veterans Hospital once a week. She brought chessboards and poetry books to recovering soldiers. One day, a young amputee asked, Do you ever feel like you didn't make it back whole? Eva answered, Gently, I didn't, but what I brought back was more useful than the pieces I lost. On the anniversary of Operation High, she returned to the jungle with Malik Bennett and a small team of memorial staff. The old battle site had changed, grown over, reclaimed by nature, but the echo of loss was still there. They planted a flag, said the names aloud, and when it was done, Malik turned to her. Think you'll ever stop fighting? Eva shook her head. Not while someone out there still thinks silence is safer. A year to the day since she stood in front of Admiral Lee and raised her shirt to show her scars. A bronze plaque was mounted at the Naval History Museum that it read, "She spoke when silence was demanded. She stood when others fell, and she bore her. Scars not as wounds but as warnings that saved countless more. Her name was below a dot, and somewhere far from policy rooms, somewhere in a jungle that once tried to bury her, a single flag waved above the treetops, defiantly unbroken. Eva Callahan had survived Dot, and the world would never forget.